Welcome to this video on Hardwick Hall and the historic environment topic. This video will go through all the key content that you need to know so that you've got everything that you need to know to support you in your revision. So in this video, we're going to look at the function of stately homes. We're going to talk about the story of Bess of Hardwick and who she was, the changes that Elizabethan stately homes show, the values, culture and fashions that stately homes reflect, and then we're going to walk through the key features of Hardwick Hall and what this tells us about Elizabethan life, and then crucially the key thinking around Hardwick Hall, the causes, the main changes that Hardwick Hall shows, and then the consequences of the building of Hardwick Hall as well. Okay, so Hardwick Hall is in Derbyshire. It's an Elizabethan manor house, stately home, a so-called prodigy house, and it was built by Bess of Hardwick, who you can see pictured there, between 1590 and 1597. And it's a really impressive building, as you can see in that picture on the right-hand side. So let's have a think about what were the function of Elizabethan houses. So you've probably learnt already that there were lots and lots of these big homes that were built in Elizabethan times. They're known as prodigy houses, and these Elizabethan manor houses, these stately homes, are very different from what happened before the Elizabethan era, say in medieval times, for example. So country houses before the Elizabethan period were mainly designed to provide defence and protection of the inhabitants. You know, you're thinking about things like fortified manor houses or indeed castles, for example. They provided employment for the local area, so people were based at those medieval castles. You had a whole function in terms of like constables and stewards and all that kind of stuff. And it was also served the point for the administration and a communal centre for the local community. So if you think about places like a great hall, for example, could serve as a place for the local community to come for a local manor court, or to come for, you know, big social events like a great feast, for example. Now, country houses during the Elizabethan era had a different purpose. One of the key changes is that it demonstrates the wealth and power of the owners. They wanted to show power both inside the home with things like posh furnishings, but also outside the home in terms of what the house looked like. It was about providing comfort and privacy as well. It was about showing knowledge of the latest fashions, particularly links to the idea of the Renaissance. And one of the key changes as well is they no longer had a military purpose. So it showed that England was a much more peaceful place, and these are homes, not fortresses. So how did the structure of Elizabethan houses change? Well, you can see here there's three other Elizabethan homes here: Longleat House, Wollerton Hall and Montacute House, which is down in Somerset. And we can see here that the structure and design of Elizabethan houses changed. So before the Elizabethan period, country houses were designed to provide a little bit around defence, but they were structured around an internal courtyard, very much for that kind of like protection. However, country houses in the Elizabethan era were much more open and had a very different design. The emphasis was on them being symmetrical and balanced and about providing kind of good order. They were often built in an E shape to honour Elizabeth herself, and we can see that with places like Hardwick Hall or Montacute House there, for example. And they were very heavily influenced by Italian Renaissance styles. Now we'll find in this presentation that Hardwick Hall was designed by the famous Renaissance architect Robert Smithson. He also designed Wollerton Hall and Longleat, and Hardwick Hall has a lot of similarities to those other Elizabethan houses. Okay, so who was Bess of Hardwick? Let's go through the story of Bess. So she was born around about 1527 at a small manor house at Hardwick in Derbyshire. And it's very important for you to understand she's from the lower gentry, so parish gentry rather than county gentry. So the story of her life is very much of her climbing up the social ranks and bettering herself, and probably that's something she wants to show off when she builds Hardwick Hall later on in her life. Now her father owned a few hundred acres, and it was likely that when she was young she was sent to live with another gentry family led by Sir John Zouche. Now it was here that she met her first husband, called Robert Barlow. Now it's thought that they married around 1543. Now he was only around 14 years old when they got married. She was around 15. There's no evidence that they actually lived together, and Robert Barlow died only 18 months after their marriage in December 1544, after the wedding, obviously. So Bess, she was left money to allow her to live a comfortable life. So that's her first marriage. Now, so a few years later, in 1547, Bess marries her second husband, Sir William Cavendish. Now, he's a little bit wealthier. This helps Bess to increase her social standing. But he dies in 1557, and that leaves Bess with a large estate at Chatsworth in Derbyshire, where she had lived together with William Cavendish. Now, within 2 years, in 1559, Bess married again, and she became the third wife of Sir William St Low, who owned more properties in Devon and Cornwall. Now, he's a favourite courtier of Queen Elizabeth I, and that gives Bess sort of connections with Elizabeth I. She gets to meet Elizabeth I, and they know each other. Now, he dies in 1565, leaving Bess a very wealthy, but also a relatively, young widow by this stage. Okay, now in 1567, Bess marries her fourth husband. Now, he's called George Talbot. He's the Earl of Shrewsbury. And he's really powerful and wealthy. He's head of one of the oldest and richest families in England. So again, Bess is climbing up that social ladder. Now, he had 6 children, he'd inherited lots of land and money, and he was, as we said, very wealthy. Now, he owned large landed estates of farmland, as well as coal mines, glassworks, iron foundries and ships. Most of his land was in the Midlands, so it fitted in really well with the properties already owned by Bess of Hardwick. So in all, we can see there that Bess had 4 husbands. Now, Bess and George's marriage was probably not particularly easy. They did argue over how much money should be spent remodelling Chatsworth House. And also, George Talbot was charged with guarding Mary Queen of Scots, and that certainly played a financial, emotional and political, caused political tensions within their marriage. So it's said that by 1584 the marriage had broken down completely. They argued over money and ownership of Chatsworth House, which Shrewsbury wanted to keep as his family home. Now, in 1583, Bess bought the manor house at Hardwick, where she'd grown up, and between 1585 and 1590 she remodelled the property, which we now know as Hardwick Old Hall. So she doesn't actually begin the building of Hardwick Hall itself until the death of her fourth and final husband. So this shows she may have planned that house as her legacy house. So here's a little bit of the appearance of Hardwick Hall. So you can see Hardwick Old Hall there in the background, which is in ruins, and Hardwick Hall, obviously, which is preserved. So we know that George Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, died in 1590, and this left Bess as one of the richest people in England. It's said that she was the second richest woman in England, only behind Elizabeth I. And this is when she begins, immediately almost, planning this new large and grand house just a few yards away from the original manor house, and she spent the rest of her life working on what we now know as Hardwick Hall, which would be built in this Renaissance style and all about making this grand impression. So let's think about Bess's personality. Well, she's intelligent and ambitious for herself, and she was respected by those around her. She had many influential friends in the Elizabethan court, like William Cecil, Robert Dudley, Francis Walsingham. And of course, Bess knew Queen Elizabeth I, and there's a great quote here for you to remember. There was a strong friendship between them. Queen Elizabeth said of Bess, "There is no lady in this land that I better love or like." So after George Talbot's death, Earl of Shrewsbury, Bess is very rich, and you've got to think about how she's got the freedom now as an independent woman to design and furnish Hardwick Hall as she'd like. So it's almost like her life's work is going into Hardwick Hall. Now, she does have wealth in her own right, apart from the inheritances that she's got from those 4 husbands. Her wealth comes from property. She's said to be a ruthless landlord, ruthlessly chasing up people that don't pay land. She's got farming interests, arable sheep farming, she's got cattle, she's got mining interests, lead mining, coal mining, iron foundries, glassworks and quarries, and her businesses provide the raw materials to produce the lead, the bricks and the glass for Hardwick Hall. For example, she owns the glassworks at Wingfield. Now, glass was very expensive at that time, so the fact that Bess had her own glassworks is crucial. So she's a shrewd business lady. It's important that we regard her as so. So she moved into Hardwick Hall on the 4th of October 1597 on what may have been the occasion of her 70th birthday. And she lived there with her granddaughter, Arbella Stewart. And this is another important fact to be aware of around Bess's story. She has a claim to the throne, and it's thought that Bess may have held out hope that her granddaughter might inherit the throne one day. And there's a picture there, of course, of Arbella Stewart. Now, Bess lived at Hardwick Hall until her death in 1608, aged around about the age of 80. And at the time of her death, she was one of the richest women in England. So she got to live in Hardwick Hall for near on 11 years. So let's think about the design of Hardwick Hall now. Now, Robert Smithson, he's a key person for you to know about. He's the architect that designed Hardwick Hall. And he's already a well-known architect for Longleat House and Wollaston Hall in Nottingham. And he also brought many other skilled craftspeople of the day, such as Thomas Akers, a marble carver who'd worked on the marble chimney piece and doorway in the best bedroom and in high great chamber. The plasterer Abraham Smith did the ornate plasterwork. A French painter called John Ballockhouse was also brought in, and all of these worked full time. So Hardwick Hall was showing off the latest fashions and technology available in Elizabethan England, as well as the wealth and status of its owners. So the design of Hardwick Hall, if you're thinking about what makes it be designed in this way, it's very much influenced by French and Italian Renaissance styles. You've got things like the loggia, the long gallery, there's Flemish designs as well. And the key Renaissance influences that can be seen are the symmetrical design, classical design with the loggia and the ornamental pillars, the emphasis on light flooding the building with light coming through the loggia, lots of glass, the long gallery to display family portraits and tapestries of things like biblical scenes showing Bess's cultural awareness. For example, the Gideon tapestries, which we'll talk more about in just a moment. And of course, the design of Hardwick Hall was influenced by patrons, friends of Bess, family, craftsmen from the time, and the architect, Renaissance architect Robert Smithson. Hardwick Hall actually had 46 rooms, but the most important ones were the 14 bedchambers, the low great chamber, the high great chamber, the great hall, the long gallery, the chapel, and the blue room, which was known as the pearl bedchamber in Bess's time. So Bess's wealth meant she could afford the latest designs and make use of new technology. Increase in double row roof building from the 1560s created greater demand for lead, and that led to technological improvements to meet demand. In the lead fields of Derbyshire, the industry was transformed by the invention of smelting mills with water wheel powered bellows and tall chimneys. By 1600, Derbyshire lead smelters produced 10 times the amount they had in 1572. And the lead for Hardwick came from Bess's foundries at Winster, Old Walk and Bonsall, which was to the west of Hardwick. And there's just a little table that you can have a look at in your own time to think about how Bess's estate used the local area from farming, mining, factories, land and forest, just as a little bit of a revision for you. So we can see there, as we said, that she had all the natural resources from her lands and her estates, for example. And Hardwick Hall, I think it's very important to see this becomes a showcase for craftsmen, but also for local materials. The building boom of the English Renaissance was just about to take off, enabling Bess to make money for herself, showing off her entrepreneurial skills. Now, one of the key things to be aware of is the amount of glass in Hardwick Hall. So it's used extensively, the glass, to make the impressive windows. And you can see here that the distinctive rhyme Hardwick Hall more glass than war shows how striking this was to contemporaries. Glass was a big status symbol. Smithson also includes some bay windows, allowing for private conversations, a place to admire the views. And Bess managed to inherit the Wingfield glassworks when her son-in-law Gilbert Taylor handed over 1/3 of her fourth husband's estate, as the will required. Gilbert Taylor had delayed doing this, which led to Bess falling out with him. Now, chimneys are very famous, but the chimneys had flues inside the building, so their lines did not interrupt the dramatic impression of the glass. Behind actually several of the great windows was actually just a stone wall, while others provided light for 2 floors of low-ceilinged rooms rather than one single room. So how the building looks on the outside and having that symmetry of the windows is really important, and that's a real Renaissance influence. Light provided by the windows must have added to the pleasure of using these rooms, so that's another key reason why Hardwick Hall might have been built, for pleasure. Robert Smithson also added the bay windows, which are used in great halls from the 15th century. Now, on the south-facing side of Hardwick Hall, the great windows would have been illuminated and warmed Bess's private rooms, making them bright and pleasant places to spend time. And during the cold winter months, the less frequently used rooms could be sealed off, whilst other rooms were warmed by extensive fireplaces, showing off Bess's wealth and power. So we'll just use this slide to just point out some key features of the outside of the building. You can see there at the bottom is what's called the loggia, which is a real sort of style in the Renaissance. You've got the thing that really strikes you when you look at Hardwick Hall is all that glass, more glass than wall. And of course you can see Bess's initials at the top, ES. I think that shows you one of her motivations for building Hardwick Hall is about everybody knowing that this is her house and it's all part of her legacy. So Elizabethan houses like Hardwick Hall did not get built around a central courtyard. All four sides of Hardwick Hall demonstrate the Elizabethan style for symmetry, balance and order. Now on each of the main floors you'll notice, if you look at the picture, that the height of the windows increases with the height of the building. So the house itself is a visual representation of the great chain of being. The lowest in society were at the bottom, the highest at the top. The servants would be on the ground floor, Bess and her family on the middle floor, and any royal visitors or important guests would occupy the best rooms on the top floor. So that's really, really important in terms of being this visual representation of the great chain of being. Now on both the western and eastern sides of the house there was a loggia. This is a covered walkway which allowed people to exercise without leaving the house and allowing them to view the surrounding landscape. Now the loggia is inspired by the Italian Renaissance. You don't see these in medieval times. Hardwick is the first example of a loggia in a house without an internal courtyard. There is a loggia on both the western and eastern sides, and it's a key fashion of the Renaissance. Now much of the interior and exterior masonry work was completed by John and Christopher Rhodes. And then at the top there is Flemish ornamental stonework shown on the crests of the towers that you can see there, that beautiful ornamental stonework. And of course, to top that off, really the initials of ES, which stands for Elizabeth of Shrewsbury, but everyone of course knows her as Bess of Hardwick. So you would enter Hardwick Hall through a gatehouse, which was a reminder and a symbolic link with medieval times. The approach to Hardwick Hall was deliberately designed to impress with grandeur and wealth. Even the driveway to Hardwick Hall is long to show off the grounds and the home. Hardwick Hall itself is built on top of a hill, so you can see it from miles around. And as the visitor approaches, the house would appear in and out of view. On top of every tower were Flemish-inspired crests with Bess's initials ES for Elizabeth Shrewsbury, showing her pride in the house and her achievements. And I think the fact that they've got this ES on the house is very much ties with that idea that the whole Hardwick Hall is built for Bess's legacy, so everybody knows that this is her house. So here's a ground floor plan of Hardwick Hall. Now the ground floor with smaller windows was mainly for servants, and you can see you go in through the Great Hall. This is now a Great Hall like being an entrance. But it's an impressive Great Hall, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Off the Great Hall were all the service rooms like the buttery, pantry, great kitchen, scullery and lower part of the chapel, which is used for servants to worship. There were around 30 servants at Hardwick Hall, and they all had blue liveried uniforms. Now, the Great Hall is a really important part of the house because the idea of a Great Hall was changing in Elizabethan houses. This is a great example of a change to write about. In medieval houses, the Great Hall performed an important administrative function, but that's less important in Elizabethan times. But Hardwick Hall, like many other Elizabethan houses, did include a Great Hall. It was designed as a large space to impress the visitor by its size. Smithson placed the Great Hall in the middle of the house, running from front to back, east to west. It allowed the hall to be more practical, warmer and with wall fireplaces. Hardwick's Great Hall was used as an impressive entrance hall for important guests, but it was also where the lower servants ate and socialised. And there's a little revision table there to help you see the difference between the medieval Great Hall and Elizabethan Great Halls. So the Great Hall, as we can see here from the plan, the entrance to the building, it's on a 90-degree angle, which is very different to medieval homes. And it meant that it was more practical and warmer, let more light into the house, provided that symmetry for the home, and on that floor plan you can very much see that symmetry. So it's a new design function and purpose for the Great Hall. So here you can see some pictures of it. Now one thing you'll notice is you can see Bess's coat of arms right above the fireplace, so immediately everybody knows whose house this is. And you know, it's a grand entrance, but the Great Hall performs a very different function in Elizabethan homes. Now the staircase at Hardwick Hall is a new design. Before the 1580s, staircases in great houses were not a single straight flight of steps, but were built in a spiral around a central supporting column or post. used by everyone. In some houses of later Elizabethan period, the central column was removed and replaced with a timber framework. Now at Hardwick Hall, a magnificent stone staircase led all the way to the most prestigious rooms at the top of the house. When Bess was entertaining important visitors, this great staircase provided a ceremonial route for a procession of waiters carrying up each course from the kitchens on the ground floor up to her guests on the top floor. Now the staircase is lined with tapestries, so this is very much a grand processional route. This is how they are showing off Hardwick Hall to visitors. Now there are lots of back staircases which were created specifically for the servants for practical arrangements, but the staircase is to provide that great processional route and grand ceremony at Hardwick Hall. So here you can see the first floor plan of Hardwick Hall. Now, in terms of the first floor plan, okay, these are the more private family rooms and include, as you can see here, things like the low grate chamber where Bess and her family would have eaten and had meals and relaxed when they weren't entertaining guests. There's also the chapel, which provided a private space for Bess to go and worship, and there's lots of bed chambers, lots of places for people to relax and have some privacy. So the inclusion of the chapel shows us about the religious life of Hardwick Hall. Now, there's two parts to the chapel. The upper part is reserved for the family. This showed how hierarchy was a key part of Hardwick Hall, but also the family's desire for comfort and privacy. Bess wanted a private place to worship, just like Queen Elizabeth I did at Hampton Court. The lower part of the chapel was used by the household, such as servants. It shows that perhaps Bess wanted to be compared to Elizabeth I. Okay, now the second floor plan of Hardwick Hall. The second floor is all about the staterooms. These are your best rooms, and you'll notice that the windows are much bigger. The ceiling height is the highest on the top floor. Remember, we said that Hardwick Hall reflected the Great Chain of Being. Now these are the staterooms, and here are the most impressive rooms, like the High Great Chamber, the Best Bed Chamber, the Pearl Bed Chamber, which is now known as the Blue Room, and of course the Long Gallery, which stretches all across that side of the building. So very, very impressive rooms on the top floor. This is about entertaining important and distinguished and maybe even royal visitors, although Elizabeth I, of course, never went to Hardwick Hall. Now, the Elizabethan Long Gallery is becoming popular in Elizabethan times. It ran down the whole east side of the house on the second floor, provided wonderful views of the surrounding countryside and gardens. This is a large inside area for exercise. Elizabethan galleries are ideal places to show off things like artwork. Bess bought 2 sets of splendid Flemish tapestries as well from the estate of Sir Christopher Hatton, who died in 1591, and she replaced Hatton's coat of arms with her own. She actually bought it for about £350, which is £100,000 in today's money. These tapestries from Christopher Hatton called the Gideon Tapestries. We'll talk about them a bit more. And sources say that she had around 97 paintings by 1601, which showed off Bess's connections, wealth and power. So you can see there a picture of the Long Gallery, gives you an idea of the scale of it, and of course the idea of the ornamental plasterwork on the ceiling, very popular in Elizabethan times, and the tapestries on the walls. So the Blue Room during the Elizabethan period was called the Pearl Bed Chamber, but it's now known as the Blue Room due to the distinct blue colouring of the furnishings and bed, and it's on the second floor. The Blue Room contains some typical features of Elizabethan houses, such as a 4-poster bed. The embroidery of gold, silver and pearls reflects the wealth of the gentry. Now within the Blue Room can be seen some of the Brussels tapestries, some of which are now in that room, and they show scenes depicting gods and imagery from the Bible. In Elizabethan times, the Blue Room tended to be used for eating, playing games and cards, reading and relaxing. And here you can just see another image of the Blue Room at Hardwick Hall. Okay, so at Hardwick Hall there was a low grate chamber and a high grate chamber. Now the low grate chamber is on the first floor. It was used for dining and entertainment, but for the family. The high grate chamber, same function, but this is used for entertaining royalty or really important guests. So it shows the importance of hierarchy at Hardwick Hall. Now in the high grate chamber, the Queen's coat of arms is above the fireplace. Now this is a very important detail. It shows Bess's loyalty as well as being her link to royal power and authority. And it may also link to the fact that her granddaughter Arbella Stuart, Bess felt she had a claim to the throne. And remember that Bess and Elizabeth I were close. Elizabeth I once said, "There is no lady in this land that I better love and like." Okay, in terms of the roof, there was a double row of rooms in the house, so we needed double pitches with an M-shaped valley gutter between them, and they're made out of lead, which you can see here, the lead roof, which is a new technology of the time. Previously, houses did not need double pitches as the houses were only one room deep. Now, all the lead was made from Bess's own foundries at Aldwork, Winster and Bonsall, and of course they had to be accessible in order to repair the roof, and also you can see a really good close-up of the chimneys here, which are all arranged symmetrically, and we can see, of course, ES Elizabeth of Shrewsbury there as well. Okay, the furnishings at Hardwick Hall are important. So the furnishing and decoration were practical and enjoyable. Rooms such as the Blue Room in Bess's time would show off her wealth. Her household was fairly small for a large house, but it operated like a mini court. Around Bess were her own family, but there were lower servants and trusted servants that maybe were closer to Bess. The Elizabethan country house allowed an owner to have private areas where they may feel more relaxed and comfortable. At Hardwick, Bess had her own withdrawing room and bedroom on the first floor, where she was less on show. She would be more on show in public areas like the chapel, but there were also places where she could worship in private. Now, in terms of furnishings, one of the key things to be aware of is that she did bring some furnishings from her old houses like Chatsworth and from Hardwick Old Hall. She prided herself on having a collection of richly decorated Turkish carpets on which fine needlework matched her best pieces of furniture, such as beds and chairs. She enjoyed embroidery and textiles. Now, one of the big things that Bess didn't have is that she didn't have decorative wood panelling, but instead she covered the walls with her collection of fine tapestries. These contained silk or metal thread in the high status rooms. Bess bought the Gideon tapestries, this is a key detail this, from the estate of Sir Christopher Hatton for £325, which is 100,000 in today's money, and she had her own coat of arms embroidered over his. So you can see here that the furniture at Hardwick Hall reflected Bess's passion for the French style. She had a set of 6 beautiful French stools, which visitors would have admired. French furniture was fashionable and used in the most important rooms. Many of her finest pieces have been collected over her lifetime. For example, when she was at Chatsworth House and married to William Cavendish, for example. Now, Bess didn't visit court very often after 1568, but she was very much aware of the latest styles and court fashions. She had much of Hardwick's furniture made on site from materials from her own estate. And it was in the best bedrooms where she combined gilded bed and the rich fabrics, textures and colours of the tapestry showed everyone her wealth, social status, and even if it was a little old-fashioned, it was good taste. She also had around about 97 paintings, 67 of these were portraits. She was from the lower gentry, as we've seen, but she rose in great importance. So she wanted to put across the importance of her legacy, family, and the continuity with the generations of her family. She showed her loyalty to the Queen, displaying pictures of Elizabeth, William Cecil, the Virgin Mary, and she used heraldry throughout the house to emphasise the importance of her family, done in places like the Great Hall and My Lady Shrewsbury's withdrawing room on the first floor, where most of the people who would see it would likely belong to a group from a lower social standing. More complicated imagery in the tapestries was used in the upper floors, with references to classical literature and mythology to show off Bess's high social standing. So basically, the paintings on the wall and the heraldry are all giving a message that Bess is important and powerful, but done in slightly different ways depending on whether it's going to be sort of lower people in the house looking at it or wealthier people in the house looking at it. There was also a lot of marble and woodwork in the home. So Thomas Akers created the marble work at Hardwick Hall, like the fireplace that you can see there in the high great chamber. They share the Renaissance style as they're symmetrical. The woodwork was based on Flemish patterns, were very fashionable at the time. She preferred to use textiles and tapestries to decorate her walls rather than wood panelling. The use of these materials reflects the fact there was an increase in wealth of the gentry and there was new materials in Elizabethan country houses. Okay, garden and grounds. So during medieval times, the area around a manor house was used for hunting, but from the 15th century, nobility wanted to have larger grounds for pleasure and relaxation. So Elizabethan gardens like those at Hardwick were laid out in a symmetrical pattern, just like Renaissance styles, with squares or quarters, as you can see on his images. They included ornamental ponds, shaded areas, aviaries, artificial lakes. Hardwick Hall had cultivated gardens with walled enclosures. There was also an orchard in the gardens, which, along with the kitchen garden, supplies the house with fresh herbs, fruit and vegetables, and of course gives people in the house something beautiful to look down upon, especially if you're standing in that long gallery, you could look down on the gardens. Okay, so that concludes our walkthrough of the key content for Hardwick Hall. There's some key points there we've learnt about. Hardwick Hall was completed in 1597, built by Bess of Hardwick. The house was an Elizabethan prodigy house designed to show off Bess's power and show off her wealth. She was a wealthy woman in her own right who had multiple businesses. It supplied much of the materials used in Hardwick Hall. The home was designed by Robert Smithson. Some of the finest craftsmen of the day worked on Hardwick Hall. Key features of the Hardwick Hall are the amount of glass, more glass than wall, the great hall on the ground floor, the processional staircase, the high great chamber and the long gallery. Elaborate furniture such as tapestries and fine Turkish carpets showed off her wealth, and Bess's granddaughter, Bella Stuart, did have a claim to the throne as well. So there you have it. That's the history of Hardwick Hall.